Welcome to our presentation, Scenario Planning for a Post-Pandemic Workplace by Drs. Betsy Sparks and Jack McCann. Many managers were challenged by the pandemic and needed to modify their strategies to remain viable. And the pandemic's long-term effects on business are hard to estimate, as many businesses were forced to close, according to Donfu and Gustafsson. The unpredictable future has made choosing a strategy aligned with the turbulent external environment challenging, and carving a path for sustainability a real task. And the high levels of uncertainty and reduced revenues made business operate differently and display resilience to remain open. The purpose of this paper is to examine scenario planning as a tool for managers to assist with the post-pandemic future of work and provide 4 scenario descriptions for a large telecommunications company in the United States. First, we examine the state of the business environment and introduce scenario planning, describe the scenario planning process, cover the use of scenario planning, and look at the theoretical foundations and explore scenario planning and provide possible outcomes, concluding with the scenarios about the regional telecommunication operations. And then we also discuss limitations and future research. The state of the business environment is that during the pandemic, business couldn't deliver their products and services through their traditional channels because the government required shutdowns, resulting in employees being furloughed or terminated. Leadership hadn't considered these possibilities, that a pandemic would cause so much disruption in daily business operations. Traditional management theory, may not be sufficient to address the volatile change caused by such a rare event like a pandemic that affects the current state of work and also the future. And as Skoblik described, it doesn't make much sense to look back when the present does not resemble the past. How can you learn from the past when you don't have much to reflect on? So to make an effective strategy during these times, perhaps companies need to constantly explore and institutionalize imagination. And strategic foresight, can help imagine multiple futures in a creative way. It may heighten our sense and our abilities to shape and sense and adapt what may happen in the years to come. Continuing on the state of the business environment, acronyms like VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and TUNA, turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous, are used to describe the future. To make an effective strategy, companies need to constantly explore and use imagination. And foresight can help imagine multiple futures in creative ways, being able to shape and think about what's coming. And scenario planning is a strategic tool that can help managers imagine possible scenarios. But many companies had abandoned scenario planning by 2003 because of the time consumptions and managers' perceptions of usefulness. However, Oliver and Parrott, 2018, explained the importance of scenario planning to develop strategy and pointed that there's a resurgence in use for uncertain market conditions, especially today. Managers are going to use scenario planning to expand their thinking and see a broader range of possibilities with new opportunities. Certainly, scenario planning is performance-based and used to change thinking and improve decision-making. And it involves learning by interpreting a situation, applying new perceptions to formulate policy and implement policy. Scenario planning background. Scenarios are just described as stories that portray possible futures. Herman Kahn, a founder of future studies, defined scenarios as hypothetical events set in the future to construct a possible chain of causal events. And scenario planning is a description of a possible or probable future. And Chermak and Lenham and Skoblik begins with, said that strategic planning begins with a critical need or a focal issue that could impact the environment. And the theory or practice of scenario planning is a know-how that encompasses perceptual skills, transition understanding across time, and understanding of the particular in relation to the general. Managers use scenario planning to expand thinking and see a broader range of future possibilities. Scenario planning methods differ, and some can be more of an art form, some that take an iterative approach, and others have a mechanical, technical approach. With high levels of uncertainty, scenario planning is important. Um, Decision makers have worked through a wide range of possible futures. They can adapt more quickly to turbulent environments and are more prepared, according to Chermak. So the theoretical foundation for scenario thinking is the theory of practice. And Benner cited in Doherty find the theory of practice is richly socially embedded clinical know-how that encompasses perceptual skills, transitional understandings across time, and understanding of that particular in relation to the general. And the practices of scenario planning are simply what people do in situations. And with scenario thinking, an ontological dimension addresses human actions and practices in context, while epistemological dimension addresses the understanding of the past and future and current presence, and a praxeological dimension addresses coping with uncertainties. Sarpong and McLean, 2011. Scenario planning is now, again, with a resurgence, is widespread among governments and business for predicting the future and determining ways to think about the future. Unfortunately, companies may only conduct one exercise in planning or don't utilize their findings in a meaningful way, spreading the learning throughout the organization, or conducting multiple exercises to look at multiple scenarios. So strategic foresight, got its start after World War II when the U.S. Air Force set up the RAND Corporation as a think tank for military planning, according to Metzner and Rieger and Skoblik. The use of scenario planning by businesses originated at Royal Dutch Shell in the late 60s and early 1970s, according to Watt 1985, and forecasts, which are often accurate, are based on the premise that the future business environment will be consistent with today's environment. And as we know, uh, today's pandemic is unprecedented and certainly novel and something we haven't experienced. Since the development and refinement of scenario planning, Shell Corporation created scenarios for oil supply, distribution, pricing, constrained growth, energy demand, and speculation about the former Soviet Union's longevity and globalization. Then we look at an example of scenario planning with an organization of today with institutionalized strategic foresight and scenario planning is the U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard's motto is focused on planning. It's Semper Paratus, which means always be ready. The Coast Guard has its day-to-day requirements and various contingencies, including natural and human caused disasters, along with its mission of diplomatic assistance and medical support, and predicting its daily requirements, in some cases is challenging, but the Coast Guard has to consider environmental demands and, long-term planning. They're very challenging for this group. So they established Evergreen, the Coast Guard's program to support strategic foresight. So it's, created a series of reports, regarding Coast Guard strategy and goals, potential future challenges and scenarios. And the intent of Evergreen was to contribute a more forward-thinking Coast Guard to approach future challenges. It's been very, very successful for this organization.
Thank you, Dr. McCann. I'm going to talk with you about our application of scenario planning to a large telecommunications company operating in the United States. And we looked at this company and what we knew about this company and our interactions with this company to develop 4 first generation exploratory scenario descriptions for the post pandemic future of work. And the telecommunications company, noted as telco to protect the company identity, employs high and low skilled employees and contractors to design, build, and provide residential and commercial customer services. And these services include everything from your basic telephone service to cellular service to data services and also some original video content, including all the electronic equipment that is delivered to both residential and commercial customers. Now, one problem that telco faces is the need for high and low skilled workers to design, build, and install these networks and also to maintain the networks that they need to provide the residential and commercial services. Now, the problem that occurred with the pandemic is telco has workers deployed throughout the geographical region, and they report to assigned locations so that their drive time is minimized to the job sites. So work center locations before the pandemic were optimized so that they could provide service to rural, suburban, and urban areas based on the density of the existing lines, the demand for service, and the expected growth rates. When the pandemic occurred, the shifted service demands required that many businesses, the people that were reporting to work there, their employees began working from home. And as more employees worked from home, the traffic on the business networks decreased, but the traffic in the residential networks greatly increased. So as the traffic became unbalanced, so did the work locations where the telco employees were reporting to work. So telco does not have employees aligned with network demands and the requirements, which created a problem from the pandemic. So to better understand the situation that telco faces, we looked at Google data. Now, Google uses public data to track when people make visits to places such as grocery stores, pharmacies, parks, transit stations, retail and recreation, residential and workplace. And the two that we're going to focus on are the residential and the workplace. So what happens is the Google data is aggregated and anonymized based on the user settings, connectivity, and private threshold. So if you have users who have opted in to location history in their Google account, they can be tracked through Google. And this is what this graph shows. The baseline for the comparison in the Google data was calculated by obtaining the mean for the corresponding day of the week during the 5-week period from January 3rd to February 6, 2020, before lockdown measures occurred. So as you look at this, you can see the information for work and residential mobility as a percent change from the baseline. And this is plotted out from February 10th, 2020 through February 9th, 2021. And if you look at what's happening, here's the 0% change. And here's what's happening in residential. Notice how your workplace is the solid black and your residential is the dotted lines. So the traffic has greatly increased percentage-wise from that baseline in the residential areas, whereas in the workplace areas, it's running in the negative percentages, which means it's much lower due to people working from home than it had prior to this period. And if you're interested in this information, you can look on just Google mobility data, and Google can show you how all of these are calculated, and that's also included in our paper. So now you see what is happening with telco because the demand has shifted. We've gone from the business place to home and residential with people working. So some of the key issues that for telco, when you're looking at scenario planning, one of the first steps that needs to happen is you need to look at the key issues facing the company. Telco needs capital to reinforce the existing network by adding their fiber optic cable for 5G capabilities and also to increase data and video services to subscribers. Because of the pandemic, some businesses were behind in their payments for their services to telco. There's also been a geographical demand shift. Now people are working from home. There's much more traffic on residential networks than because the business traffic on the business networks has shifted towards residential. Telco is also facing issues with securing and retaining personnel. You've got highly skilled and lowly skilled people that are needed to build this network, and some things have happened with unemployment and unemployment benefits, so it's harder to find the lower skilled employees because of all the government subsidies that are being given and unemployment extended. So telco can't hire as many unskilled employees to begin training them to learn the higher skilled functions that occur within that operation. And the union workforce is not geographically aligned now with the current demand because your demand has shifted away from some of the high business commercial areas, and it's now in the residential, and you may not have enough workforce. And this creates a problem because if the union workforce isn't aligned, there's additional costs that are incurred when union workers are transported to different work centers to complete the necessary projects that Telco is working on to reinforce the networks. Also, contact tracing has rendered some geographical locations inoperable. The employees have to quarantine, and if an entire work group is affected in a geographical area, then that whole work group may be quarantined, and you may have to move maintenance workers from other parts of the district or the region to meet the demands for maintenance and growth requirements. And some field employees are restricted from sharing vehicles because there's social distancing requirements. Next, we look at some of the trends that were occurring. The government regulations and shutdowns had impacted employees commuting to office locations for telco employees and for telco customers. Supply chains were impacted during the pandemic, making it difficult to secure some types of equipment that was needed to complete the projects and to perform maintenance. Stimulus checks and the extended unemployment benefits have decreased lower skilled workers applying for jobs for temporary and contract positions. The high labor costs drive up the cost of building the infrastructure. Some government funding may be available to provide high-speed internet to disadvantaged populations and first responders. So this may be an opportunity to build out some networks based on additional government funding. There's also increased competition. It makes it more challenging to secure bandwidth, increase the cellular customer base, and stream video services. Some of the key uncertainties that exist. The geographical demand. Where is this demand going to be coming from post-pandemic? Will the company be able to secure capital, fiber cable, and electronics to develop the infrastructure? The bandwidth availability to deliver the 5G and other data video services, because this bandwidth has to be purchased on these auctions and there has to be free cash to spend to buy this bandwidth. Securing trained labor forces in geographical areas with high demand. In other words, The areas that have the highest demand, the forces aren't aligned, and we don't know if that alignment is going to change. Also, acquiring and redistributing workforce and contractors to align with demand, and the continuance of social distancing and contact tracing. If you're having to social distance, this puts a strain on your vehicles if workers can't ride together. So, based on these key uncertainties, the trends, and the key issues, we looked at 5 different variables and created 4 scenario descriptions. We looked at virus severity. If the virus is under control, and then we consider that low virus severity. For the geographical demands for service stability, if the geographical demand aligns with what the pre-pandemic was considered the demand in those particular areas and the workers are aligned, then we considered that good stability, so that was considered high stability. We looked at supply chain stability. If the supply chain stability is high, then the goods and products and electronic equipment that we need to complete these projects was available, and so there was high supply chain stability. We also looked at revenue collection and capital availability and stability. So if we were able to collect revenue from customers, if everything had gone back to normal, then that would be high revenue collection and capital availability stability. And then the human resource stability. If that was high, then we were able to secure high and low skilled workers that were needed to build these projects, provide maintenance, and handle the infrastructure. So in our first scenario, we titled it Gone But Not Forgotten. The virus is gone, but we still have a little bit of after effects, but things have basically returned back to normal. Businesses are open with few government restrictions, healthcare facilities are back to standard operations, and you can read these whole descriptions in the PowerPoint that we have posted online. The focus for the company from this point forward is to build new infrastructure to meet growing demands, to secure additional bandwidth for 5G and new technological advances, employee development and training, and build a reserve fund for the next few crises. So this is one of those scenarios. And as you look at these scenarios, you see the creativity of the people involved is important because they're trying to look at different things that could happen in the future. And this is not a forecast, it is just a way to open up management and leadership's thinking about what could happen post-pandemic to the future of work. The second scenario we entitled Created a New Normal. And as you notice, the new normal has moderate virus severity, moderate geographical demand for services stability. So our demand's still kind of shifting. People are still kind of working from home. There's maybe less demand in the business commercial areas than there has been. So we're calling that a moderate level of stability. Our supply chain is still moderate because you're still getting outbreaks of the virus. The pandemic's still continuing to affect telco. You still have these healthcare initiatives in place. There's still a lot of social distancing and contact tracing, and that has to weigh heavily on management because management has to make sure that these employees are following this healthcare initiatives and to keep the employees safe. So some companies have reduced the telco services due to employees working from home. So you may have businesses that could be cutting some of their services because they're seeing they may not need such a high data flow rate coming into their commercial operations. And also the telco company has had to purchase additional trucks and specialized vehicles so companies can be productive or increase contract work to stabilize the network demand. So you see these levels of our 5 variables that we're examining in this scenario planning. So here's the focus of what, based on this scenario, that telco would need to look forward in their planning and strategy processes. Examine lease renewals because if more people are working from home, then they may not need the office space. They're going to have to look at more innovative logistics practices for a more portable workforce. Have to reduce operating expenses because the revenue is being reduced. So you can see those. Then our third scenario we entitle Tougher Times. In this case, the virus is rampant, the pandemic continues to occur. And China and East Asian companies have kind of rebounded and they're able to provide their products, but the supply chain for telco is global. So some of the supply chain is still doing okay, but some of the supply chain is still struggling. There's still services, the geographical demand is still, low because we don't have a lot of stability. It's still fluctuating because the virus keeps impacting. So our revenue collection and capital availability stability, it's in the below the moderate range, and our human resources are still unstable because there's still initiatives and government stimulus that's going on, and we can't get workers that are consistently reporting to work, and we're still dealing with the quarantine issues. So, based on the scenario 3, we may have to increase our motor vehicles. We may have to shift employees' work locations. We may have to consider furloughing employees because the demand may be down and to reduce operating expenses. And we may have to look at more outsourcing of work in geographical areas where the demand cannot be met by the telco employees by forging new relationships with contractors. So our fourth scenario is dark times. And in this case, the virus is still out there. The pandemic just continues. Contact tracing, social distancing are just a current way of life. The geographical demand for services stabilities is even lower in the dark times. So we don't have a handle on where people are going to be working, where the services are going to be needed. So that geographical demand stability is low. The government debt's at a record high. Businesses and consumers are defaulting on their payments. And we've got isolationism as a global practice as countries close borders to contain the virus. So this causes a lot of instability in the supply chain. And we've got major supply chain disruptions occurring. And lower paid employees are not working because of increased unemployment benefits, stimulus payments, and the need to stay home and care for their children because the schools are closed back down and there's not childcare readily available. So telco's having some problems hiring and retaining field employees that align with the geographical demand for work. So we have a real high instability, so there's very low stability in human resources. And we look at the focus under this scenario of developing better working practices to comply with social distancing, reinstating supply chains through contacts with new providers, looking at vertical integration, and you can see all of these in the PowerPoint that we have posted online. So why would you want to use scenario planning? The outcomes of scenario planning are important because it takes a lot of capital investment in terms of human capital to develop the scenarios, and many times consultants are hired to come in and assist with developing these scenarios. So one of the most important outcomes is organizational learning. Scenario planning is important because building organizations that can learn faster than the competition can give an organization competitive advantage. Scenario planning also shifts management and leadership perceptions to include uncertainty in the planning process. Scenario planning can help managers look at different futures for the business that they would not have seen before they used scenario planning. It can also change the organizational culture. When we talk about changing the organizational culture, we're talking about adapting to changes in the environment because the employees are sharing the mental model of what the organization can become. And individuals act as members of their organizations and they base their actions on the understanding of the organization's norms, beliefs, and values. Scenario planning can also lead to increased organizational creativity and innovation. We talked about the social theory of practice, and there's companies that have developed these scenarios, and it's resulted in creative emergence with opportunities for innovation. So, some of the limitations and conclusions for this research. Well, this was an example of an exploratory scenario planning process with 4 descriptions of scenarios. This needs to become a recursive process. In other words, once you examine these scenarios, then you go back to the drawing board. You may revise and edit those based on what you begin to find out about the future. And scenarios are limited by the creativity of those that are developing the scenarios. Telco should isolate strategies that are useful for multiple futures. If you have 4 different scenarios and you start seeing areas of focus that emerge that could be used in your strategy for 2 or 3 of those scenarios, then those strategies are most useful for the company because that takes into a broader range of uncertainty. There's also a limitation. Google mobility data is a sample of the population of users who have opted into location history, and it may not be representative of the entire population. So further research is needed on refining the scenario planning methodology. Thank you for attending this presentation. We hope it's been helpful. Have a great day.